Hi there, I'm Nina Goradia. I'm a Somatic Experiencing practitioner on the non-dual path. Today's video is not for everyone, and I want to put this disclaimer in the beginning. This is a video about letting go of doership and personal will. It's really not for someone who's at the beginning of their trauma healing journey, because we do need those feelings and those experiences to be seen and heard, processed, shared. And so if we jump straight to something like this, it can be a spiritual bypass. So I just want to caution you that it might feel a bit invalidating if you haven't done a lot of the trauma work yet. And that's not the intention. The intention of this video is to help people who've been on the trauma journey for a long time and feel that they may have plateaued out. Because in my experience and with my clients, I've seen that there's only so far that we can really go on this journey on the trauma level of the individual. And so once we plateau out there, we might find it useful to expand the perspective so that we can hold such difficult and tragic pains that can only be held with a larger perspective, because it's really hard to just rationalize that it was okay that those things happened. And so as we expand the perspective, and for me, that meant going into the non-dual field and spirituality and using it in a really rational way. It's actually a very rational practice, but seeing what is, who I am, and where the ego causes suffering has helped me so much on this path, go beyond simply somatic experiencing trauma healing at the personality level. So I hope it can benefit you as well. But the next step in reducing suffering is being willing to say, okay, I'm going to put all my trauma stories in the past. That doesn't mean that they're not going to come up and it's okay if they need to be looked at again. But in general, I'm ready to be beyond this. I've suffered enough. And I don't want what happened to me to be defining me or being what the rest of my life is going to be like. And when we make that kind of decision, we are then ready to kind of renounce the trauma ego identity altogether. So when we're surrendering personal will, we're surrendering the ego program and all the stories that we have about the traumas. But the good news is once we surrender those things, we are much more easily able to perceive our true identity, which is infinite consciousness. If that resonates for you, just take or leave whatever feels right for you in this video. But when we think of ourselves as the observer of the thinking, of the feeling, of the body, I can't be any of these things because they're always changing. None of them are permanent. And for them to be my identity, they'd have to be permanent. For something to have identity, it needs to have duration. Otherwise, it's just a process that happened. It's not a fixed identity. So if all of these things are changing, what is the one thing that's constant? And that is our true nature. And so an intermediate teaching is it's the one who's watching. There's still a sense of being with that one. And you need to go there. You don't want to bypass that. But once you've seen that through and then you go further, it's like, oh, I'm nothing when I look inside and I'm everything when I look outside. And when we ground ourselves in this identity, which can feel quite groundless actually, but very peaceful once you get used to it. Once we ground ourselves in this, we can let go of smaller identities. It doesn't mean the traumas didn't happen, they happened. But who am I? I want to be who I am. I want to be who I really am. I don't want to be what happened to me, what maybe other people did to me, what they did can't dictate my identity. I want to own my real full identity. So in order to do that, I've got to start becoming aware of when there's a little ego program saying that my identity is this or that, and it's identifying with lots of things that are usually external, usually about something about me physically or what other people think or what other people did to me, what other people said, who I think I am, and I'm this kind of person, not that kind of person, right? And it's always saying all these things to us, and it's using the word I. So it feels like it's me, but it's not. It's just using the word I. It's just a program. Anything you've ever heard, fair game to pop in your head because the mind's like a receiver. Just spit it back out at you at any moment. It's fair game, any moment. It's not who you are, it's a program. And we can use these thoughts functionally sometimes. We can use them for self-inquiry, discernment, where to put our attention. Those are higher functions of the mind, but lower functions, just the program just spitting out stuff. It's not you, right? If I can look at it, I can't be it. If I'm aware of it, I have to be the one who's aware of it. I have to be the one watching. I can't be it. So everything I've said so far is a bit of a review for many of you who follow the channel, but I've got a lot of new information for you here today about efforting. So I've made a previous video about the difference between psychological ego and somatic ego, which I'll link here so that you can get more information. But in general, it's just two arms of ego. So one is psychological thoughts and the activity around that. And then one is, in the body, the fearful somatic reactions we have. And for this video, we're going to focus mostly on the psychological ego. The psychological ego, what it does is it's always resisting what is. It's identifying with stuff, as I just mentioned, all of those kind of things that are our false identity, not our true identity. It's false identity we take on, but it has nothing to do with who we are. It has maybe a lot to do with our experiences in this relative reality and ideas that we might have assumed about ourselves because of that. But it's usually not based in any sort of absolute truth. And so efforting is kind of this churning activity. And it's just like trying to help us not feel emotions usually, but it's oftentimes compulsive thinking. And you can feel it. You can feel tension here. You can feel just energy being pulled up here. And they say our brain uses more glucose than the rest of the body because it's just always, flexing and chewing on something and trying to fix something, solve something, make this moment better. There's all sorts of ways that you can kind of notice this efforting. But basically, what this efforting does is it just causes more and more thoughts. So more and more mental proliferation. So as mentioned in that video I just referenced, basically what happens is these thoughts, these psychological thoughts, they're causing this proliferation of thoughts and activity, and then it's causing tension in the body, and it's activating the somatic ego, and it's just causing a lot of suffering and draining energy from the body. So, usually we still have some desires on this planet. We're here to do certain things, but if they're coming from ego, we have to kind of let those play out many times. You can kind of tell someone, but usually they don't see the futility of a lot of egoic actions until they realize they can never get peace from it. And once we've let that play out enough, we have to be, ready to say, okay, I've suffered enough. I don't want to suffer anymore. I want to renounce this false identification in favor of my real identification, my real identity, the true self, the nature of which, once we remove this ego and we feel it, there's no psychological suffering. It's just complete peace, being at ease. When you go deeper, you go even into bliss. So Rupert Spirit's teacher, Francis Lucille, he says effort is ignorance. And I've tried this out a lot, and I agree completely because, well, of course, it depends what direction the effort is going in. So if the effort is going into ego building, then it's ignorance because it's just proliferating suffering, even if we do get temporary highs sometimes, but there's always a crash that comes with it. So why are we doing this? Like, why are we doing this efforting? Well, I want to give an example of why. I said earlier, it's to not feel certain emotions. So if somebody grew up and had traumas and then they made those traumas to mean, or they interpreted that means I'm not good enough, and they feel worthlessness or shame, they might be efforting to be successful so that they don't have to feel that. It's okay to be successful, but when we're doing it to not feel, that's the ego activity. That's the psychological ego strategizing, trying to help you, protect you from feeling when you just didn't have the capacity to, because with traumas, we usually didn't have the capacity. It had to get saved. And so it was an effective strategy until we realized, well, the strategy causes me suffering because I'm spending all my time trying to avoid what the feeling is. So if I can collapse the defense and the strategy, I can start accessing more of what's stuck down here. Then I can free myself from that. So as you observe this ego efforting, you'll notice it's just a lot of constant mental activity. And it's just constantly building a structure, reinforcing it, patching up, ego injuries. It's just always building to not feel vulnerable emotions. And so not only is it building through the thoughts, our attention being placed on these thoughts is further feeding it. And so when we give it this importance, it grows. And so when we start to shift attention away from our thoughts, because we have to realize this has never given me peace before, ever, permanently. These thoughts, they cause me suffering. I have to lose interest in what these thoughts are saying. And then I shift my attention to sensory perceptions. I have a video about that here. Or to something pleasant that's not ego enhancing, some hobby or something I like to do. Or to my duty in life, my dharma, or my life purpose, what gives me meaning. As we start shifting our attention to those things, ego starts starving. It starts, not getting the attention it needs. It starts dissolving. It might fight back. It might get angry. Hey, you still need me. But don't fall for it. It's just trying to get fed. It's just trying to get its supply. And as we keep shifting that attention away, we build that muscle of being able to shift that attention. And this starts collapsing. With that collapsing, you might feel some emotions arising because they're not getting defended anymore. And that's totally great because they're here to free you. And if they're coming up, you have enough capacity. They're not going to come up if you don't have enough capacity. So as we are not giving them the attention that they want, these thoughts of the psychological ego, as we're not giving them importance, all of this is basically collapsing. And we want to start surrendering. So how do we surrender this thinking, this psychological ego exactly? Well, first, we're going to start observing what type of activity is going on in our minds. So regular mind activity is like just functional thoughts, like I need to make a left turn, I need to go to the bank, not causing suffering. The ego activity is going to have psychological thoughts that cause suffering. Specifically, they're going to consist of thoughts regarding, I'm not okay with this moment, I always need to make this moment better, just a general resistance to life on life's terms, thoughts about one's worth and identity that are based on external factors, as I mentioned before. So next, we deprive the psychological ego of attention by shifting our attention away from thinking. We've gotten wise to this. This has never worked before. It's never made me feel better. I'm going to shift away. I'm not even going to listen to this nonsense, this gibberish. I'm going to shift away and put my attention on my sensory perceptions, which would be like listening, seeing, body sensations, especially if they're neutral or pleasant. That can be very helpful. And when I shift this attention away from thoughts onto these things, it actually eases my psychological suffering. It also feels energizing, fulfilling, satisfying. And I'll make a future video on dharma and effort, because effort put in the direction of dharma or duty or life purpose, it's going to ease the psychological suffering, but you're still efforting in a healthy direction. You're putting it into a direction where you're going to harmonize your individual will with the greater divine will, and you're not going to be fighting against what is. So you have energy, right? So we have to figure out a place to put it skillfully in order to have a sustainable way of being where we're not going to get burnt out or have the ups and downs of the ego crashing and, feeling high and then paying for it afterwards. And by doing this, we are also cutting our attachments to thinking. And that is really great because these psychological thoughts, they are basically attachments, and attachments cause suffering. And so as we're giving up these attachments, we're basically cutting off parts of the ego, because ego is the sum of our attachments. And I have made a video about attachments that I'll link here, but the more that we let go of them, the more ease we will start to feel and the more peace. So the ego has tried very hard to live life on its terms. And it's always suffered as a result of this, as well as being disconnected from the greater awareness of our true identity and our greater life force that comes from equanimity. So when the ego surrenders to the larger will, it's in harmony finally. And the larger will you can think of in many ways as the absolute or oneness. There's lots of ways to think of this, the universe. Some people say this grand play or lila that's happening. And the ego, it can't really see that greater vantage point. And so it only understands a small portion of life. It only sees a small portion. And so we have access to this life force when we are harmonized with the greater intelligence. We have access to this intuition. We have access to peace, and we're not living in resistance. So this involves surrendering our attachment also to the outcomes of what we do. So I'm just doing it because it feels right and it feels like the right thing to do. It's my duty, it's my life purpose. So when we're efforting, but not for ego building, but because it is something that feels right, then that effort now has an intrinsic reward. We're simply doing it to be true to our real self and in harmony with life. The result of doing this is mental peace. So as I've mentioned before, ego is the sum of all of our attachments. So when we begin renouncing these attachments, starting with renouncing our thoughts, our psychological ego thoughts, we experience more peace. When we're no longer feeding these mental attachments, we may have primary emotions arise because, again, we're not defending anymore from feeling. So I'll link a video here about primary emotions. And we'll still need to feel through these emotions. They're on their way out, but they're on their way out because there's just no longer mental resistance trapping them in the body. So that's really awesome. That's really great for freeing oneself. And so you can do the emotional work as it arises, but you can almost think of the emotional work as like there's a boat that's full of water and you're just bailing the water out of the boat. But you got to look at this waterfall that's like falling into the boat. And that's the mental proliferation, the psychological ego that's causing a lot of this stuff. And so we got to plug that up. And then the bailing of the boat actually has some effect that we want. And so do the emotional work as it arises. And that's also going to free you from the emotional attachments. So see, here we're freeing from mental attachments, and here we're freeing from emotional attachments because they're connected and they get stuck together usually. So when one goes, the other one's usually on its way out. So make sure that you're allowing for those experiences as you're doing this work and focusing on what's happening here. Just scan your body and see if something's arising as well. So we need to stop efforting and thinking about our story also for trauma to be released. So whenever I work with people, we think of the memory, find where it is in the body, but then we have to put the story aside in order for this to get released. If I keep thinking about this, it's going to keep creating and keep storing or blocking it. So when I'm living in a way where I'm shifting attention away from my story and my psychological thoughts, I'm basically inviting all of that to come up. So even trying to remember traumas that you can't remember, sometimes that can show up as efforting in a way that blocks the emotional aspect of this trauma. So you can just try to be at ease, try to be in your body, try to shift attention away from ruminative thoughts, and trust it's all going to come up on its own as your body's ready. So let's summarize some key points here while adding a few more pointers as well. So ego is the sum of all of our attachments to thinking in the mind, attachments to emotions in the body that get stored as stored emotions. Psychological ego builds with psychological thoughts. These are often mental strategies to not feel emotions. Our attention feeds them, and the importance and the belief that we give to these psychological thoughts, they create emotions in real time that are produced in the body. And this is in my original video where I have the trauma flow chart and I kind of talk about all this in detail. So this often causes body tension, other sensations in the body, and that activates the somatic ego, which again, you can check the video, psychological ego versus somatic ego. But that somatic ego gets activated and then it drains the body of energy. And this can cause chronic illness and fatigue. So it's really important to kind of watch what's happening here so you're not allowing it to suck the energy from your body and drain yourself all day. So on the days I notice when I'm much more aware of this than others, I have like unlimited energy. And then when I notice a little lull in my energy, I'm like, oh, what am I thinking? And I pull my attention back up here. And it's amazing because just with the surrender, it literally feels like I drank a sip of coffee because when this is depleting energy. So just the surrender, instantly you have more energy available to you. It's really cool. So I recommend you try it. Let me know if that happens for you too. But as you shift your attention away from these psychological thoughts onto your senses, or onto something you enjoy that's not ego enhancing, or onto something that feels like your purpose, your life purpose, you're going to have this ego dissolve slowly over time. And just remember to focus on the moment at hand. You're only responsible for freeing yourself from ego in this moment. When we keep adding burden to ourselves, like, oh, I have to do this perfectly and I have so much to do, and will I be able to do this tomorrow? We're just stacking, and we're actually continuing to churn a lot of the psychological activity here. So we're building again. So it's just, no, I'm just here, responsible for being present right now. And if I'm caught in something, I'm just responsible for freeing myself in this moment. You don't have to get enlightenment or reach enlightenment. You just have to be here now in every moment. And that's the way. That's a way that's very effective. So when you free yourself from ego in this moment, you're going to start noticing that instantly your attention frees up. What may have been focused attention, on the mind, and this activity, it's very narrow attention, it suddenly becomes freed up and wider. So this freedom is a freedom of where to place my attention. And it's also a freedom from psychological suffering. We still have pain. Someone hurts my hand, I'm going to feel the pain of it, but I don't have to have a bunch of thoughts about it. So that's the difference between pain and suffering. Suffering is psychological. Our relationship with what's happening in life. In the next video, I'll make a guided meditation for undoing unconscious effort so that you can have more guidance on how to do this practically. And so I hope these videos are helpful to you on this distanceless journey to peace. Best wishes. Take care.